Case 1. January 4, 2015, Manhattan. Hedge fund manager Thomas Gilbert Sr., a 70-year-old financier, was found dead inside his Beekman Place apartment. He had been shot once in the head and was discovered lying on his bed. A handgun rested on his chest, positioned in a manner that suggested self-inflicted harm. At first glance, the scene appeared consistent with suicide. There were no signs of forced entry, and the apartment showed no obvious evidence of a struggle. Within days, however, investigators began to question whether the death had been staged. As attention narrowed, suspicion shifted away from an unknown intruder and towards someone inside the victim's immediate family. Police responded to a 911 call placed shortly after the discovery of the body. Officers arrived at the Beekman Place residence and secured the scene, noting the placement of the firearm and the absence of disturbance in the apartment. The victim's wife had been away briefly before returning home to find her husband unresponsive. Emergency responders confirmed that Thomas Gilbert Sr. was already deceased. While the initial assessment leaned toward suicide, standard procedure required a full forensic examination. As detectives reviewed the timeline of that evening, they began identifying elements that did not align with a self-inflicted shooting. The way the weapon had been positioned and the lack of gunshot residue patterns raised questions. The evidence at the scene did not fully support the first assumption. Thomas Gilbert Sr. was a successful hedge fund manager who had built significant wealth over decades in finance. He lived comfortably and maintained a high standard of living. For years, he also financially supported his adult son, Thomas Gilbert Jr., who was in his early 30s at the time. Despite completing an Ivy League education, the younger Gilbert was not independently employed and relied on regular financial assistance from his parents. This arrangement had continued well into adulthood, creating a long-term dependency. Shortly before the killing, Thomas Gilbert Sr. had decided to reduce his son's monthly allowance by a small amount. While minor in scale, the decision marked a shift in the financial dynamic. Investigators later identified this reduction as a critical factor in understanding the events that followed. As the investigation progressed, detectives reconstructed the movements of everyone who had been in or around the apartment that evening. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings, phone records, and witness accounts were reviewed. Detectives noted that Thomas Gilbert Jr. had been present at the apartment shortly before the shooting. Further examination of the bedroom revealed inconsistencies in the blood spatter and firearm placement. The gun did not appear to have fallen naturally after discharge. Investigators also learned that the victim's wife had been asked to leave the apartment briefly, creating a narrow window in which the shooting could have occurred without witnesses. These findings shifted the case from a suspected suicide to a potential homicide. Then, a closer look at the suspect's actions before and after the incident revealed a more deliberate sequence of events. Evidence collected by law enforcement established that Thomas Gilbert Jr. had access to the weapon used in the killing. Records confirmed prior possession of firearms and ammunition. Investigators determined that the shooting had occurred while the victim was seated or lying down, consistent with an execution-style act rather than self-harm. The deliberate placement of the gun on the body suggested an attempt to mislead authorities. When confronted with the accumulating evidence, the narrative of suicide could no longer be maintained. The case against the son centered on planning, opportunity, and motive. Financial dependence, recent conflict over money, and physical evidence all converged to identify him as the responsible party. Thomas Gilbert Jr. was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and related weapons offenses. During the trial, prosecutors presented forensic findings, surveillance records, and testimony outlining the staged nature of the scene. They emphasized the financial dispute and the calculated steps taken to create the appearance of suicide. The defense raised issues related to mental health, but the jury focused on the physical evidence and timeline. After deliberation, Thomas Gilbert Jr. was found guilty of second-degree murder. In 2019, he was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. The case drew widespread attention, particularly within New York's financial and social circles, and became a point of discussion about entitlement, dependence, and accountability within wealthy families. Case 2. July 1, 2021, Windsor, Wisconsin. Bart and Krista Halderson, a married couple in their 50s, were reported missing after a confrontation with their son regarding his education and employment claims. The couple had last been seen at their home, where they lived with their 23-year-old son, Chandler Halderson. According to investigators, the parents had begun questioning inconsistencies in his academic progress and work history. When neither Bart nor Krista appeared for planned commitments the following day, concern grew. Within hours, attention focused on Chandler, whose explanations about their whereabouts shifted as authorities attempted to establish a timeline. Police initiated their investigation after neighbors contacted authorities to report unusual activity at the Halderson residence. Officers responding to the scene observed signs that suggested violence had occurred inside the home. Blood evidence was located in the basement, contradicting initial statements that the parents had left voluntarily for a trip. Law enforcement secured the property and began a forensic examination, documenting bloodstains and collecting samples. The discovery escalated the case from a missing persons inquiry to a suspected homicide investigation. As investigators attempted to account for the parents' movements, inconsistencies in Chandler Halderson's account became increasingly apparent. The evidence inside the home did not align with his version of events. Bart and Krista Halderson were described as supportive parents who had invested heavily in their son's future. They believed Chandler was enrolled in an engineering program and employed in a professional role related to renewable energy. He had represented himself as a successful student with promising career prospects. In reality, investigators later confirmed that he had dropped out of college and had no verified employment. The parents had recently begun pressing for documentation to confirm his claims. This growing scrutiny placed strain on the household. According to the investigative record, the confrontation over his fabricated academic and professional life occurred shortly before the parents disappeared. What had appeared to be a stable family situation unraveled rapidly once those fabrications were challenged. As the investigation expanded, detectives analyzed digital evidence tied to Chandler Halderson's movements. GPS data from his phone and vehicle placed him at several rural locations in the days following his parents' disappearance. Surveillance footage and electronic records confirmed trips inconsistent with routine travel. Forensic teams later located human remains in multiple locations, including wooded and agricultural areas, which were linked through testing to Bart and Krista Halderson. Blood evidence from the home matched the victims, establishing that at least one killing had occurred inside the residence. The digital trail contradicted Chandler's statements and established a pattern of activity centered on disposal efforts rather than search or concern. Authorities arrested Chandler Halderson after consolidating physical evidence, digital records, and documented falsehoods. Investigators detailed how he had fabricated transcripts, emails, and employment records to maintain the appearance of success. When confronted, he admitted to lying about his education and work history, but continued to deny responsibility for his parents' deaths. The weight of forensic findings and location data undermined those denials. Prosecutors characterized the case as one driven by deception and the impending exposure of long-standing lies. The arrest marked the point at which the investigation shifted fully from reconstruction to prosecution. Chandler Halderson was charged with multiple offenses, including 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. During the trial, prosecutors presented extensive digital evidence, forensic testimony, and a detailed timeline linking him to the killings and subsequent disposal of remains. The defense challenged elements of the investigation, but did not overcome the physical and electronic record. The jury returned guilty verdicts on all major counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The case concluded with a clear judicial finding that the murders were the result of deliberate actions taken to conceal years of deception, leaving no unresolved doubt as to responsibility. Case 3. July 27, 2019, Markham, Ontario. 4 members of the Zaman family were found murdered inside their residence in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The victims included Menhaz Zaman's grandmother, mother, sister, and father. The killings occurred over several hours inside the family home, with no signs of forced entry. The discovery immediately prompted a major police response, as the scale of violence suggested a targeted and contained incident rather than an external threat. Within a short period, investigators began examining whether the killings were connected to someone already inside the household. Police forced entry into the home after receiving information that pointed to online activity linked to the crime. That information originated from a gaming chat platform, where a user had posted messages describing the killings in real time. At first, the posts were dismissed by some readers as dark humor or exaggeration. As the messages continued and became more detailed, concern escalated. Screenshots were forwarded to authorities, who traced the account back to the Zaman residence. Officers arrived at the address, found the doors locked, and made entry to conduct a welfare check. Inside, they encountered multiple victims consistent with the online descriptions. The information provided through the digital platform aligned too closely with the scene to be coincidental. The victims were members of a close-knit family with strong religious and cultural ties. They believed Menhaz Zaman was enrolled at university and approaching graduation, a milestone the family had openly anticipated. Relatives and community members understood him to be working toward a professional future, supported by years of encouragement and sacrifice from his parents. In reality, investigators later confirmed that he had dropped out of school years earlier. The family remained unaware of this fact and continued to believe his academic narrative. This disconnect between expectation and reality formed a critical backdrop to the events. The family's belief in his progress stood in stark contrast to the truth that would soon emerge. Investigators reviewed the online admissions in detail, comparing timestamps, descriptions, and specific claims against the physical evidence inside the home. The sequence of events described in the chat messages corresponded with forensic findings at the scene. Locations of the victims, methods used, and the order of attacks matched the suspects' written statements. Digital forensic teams confirmed the account activity originated from a device inside the residence. Additional examination showed no evidence of outside involvement. The consistency between the admissions and the crime scene eliminated uncertainty about authorship and intent. The online posts were treated as direct confessions rather than speculative commentary. Menhaz Zaman was arrested at the scene without resistance. He admitted responsibility for the killings during initial police contact. Authorities documented that his statements aligned with both the online admissions and the physical evidence recovered from the home. There was no indication of an attempted escape or effort to conceal the crime beyond the digital disclosures already made. The arrest concluded the investigative phase quickly, as responsibility was clearly established. Law enforcement secured the residence and shifted focus to formal charging and evidence processing. Menhaz Zaman was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. He later entered guilty pleas, removing the need for a contested trial. In sentencing, the court imposed life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 40 years, the maximum period of parole ineligibility permitted under Canadian law for multiple murders. The case drew national attention due to the unprecedented use of a gaming chat platform as a medium for confession. Within the community, the outcome marked the irreversible collapse of a family built on trust and expectation. with no remaining dispute over the facts or responsibility. Case 4. July 16, 2011, Port St. Lucie, Florida. Two parents were killed inside their home while a large party took place in the same residence. Blake and Mary Jo Hadley were found dead in their master bedroom, beaten to death earlier that day. At the time their bodies lay concealed behind a locked door, dozens of teenagers gathered in the house, unaware of what had occurred. Music played, alcohol circulated, and guests moved freely through the rooms. The homeowner and host of the party was their 17-year-old son, Tyler Hadley. As the night continued, the separation between the crime and the gathering remained intact until information began to surface that shifted the focus toward him. Police became involved after receiving tips from individuals who attended the party. Several partygoers reported that Tyler Hadley had made disturbing statements during the night, including claims that he had killed his parents. Initially, many dismissed the remarks as attempts at shock or attention. As the reports accumulated, concern increased. Law enforcement responded to the residents the following day. Upon arrival, officers observed signs of heavy partying throughout the home, but noted an unusual odor and a locked bedroom door that had not been accessed by guests. When officers forced entry into the room, they discovered the bodies of Blake and Mary Jo Hadley, confirming that the killings had occurred prior to the party. The information provided by party attendees became central to establishing the timeline. The victims were Tyler Hadley's parents, who had maintained a stable household and provided for their son. Despite this, Tyler had exhibited growing behavioral problems in the months leading up to the killings. Reports indicated he had become increasingly withdrawn, engaged in substance use, and struggled academically. His parents continued to support him and maintain structure within the home. There was no indication that they anticipated violence. The household remained intact until the day of the murders, when Tyler was alone with them inside the residence. Investigators later identified these dynamics as part of the broader context surrounding the case. What appeared to be a normal family environment masked escalating personal issues that would soon surface. Investigators reconstructed events using digital messages, witness statements, and physical evidence from the home. Online communications revealed that Tyler Hadley had spoken in advance about killing his parents and hosting a party afterward. Multiple witnesses confirmed hearing similar statements before and during the gathering. Inside the home, the crime scene indicated deliberate concealment, with the bodies moved into the bedroom, covered, and the door locked. Blood evidence confirmed the killings had occurred hours before guests arrived. The absence of forced entry and the condition of the house supported the conclusion that the victims were attacked by someone inside the home. The combination of digital records and witness testimony established premeditation rather than impulsive violence. Tyler Hadley was arrested after police secured the scene and confirmed the identities of the victims. He was taken into custody without resistance. Investigators documented that the party had been intentionally held to divert attention from the killings and to create distance between the act and its discovery. The locked bedroom, shifting explanations, and corroborated statements from partygoers formed the basis of the arrest. Authorities concluded that the concealment of the bodies and the decision to host a large gathering were deliberate actions taken after the murders. With the physical evidence secured, the investigation transitioned to prosecution. Tyler Hadley was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. During the trial, prosecutors presented witness testimony, digital communications, and forensic findings to establish intent and planning. The defense raised issues related to age and mental health, but the evidence supported a finding of premeditation. He was convicted and initially sentenced to life in prison without parole. Following changes in juvenile sentencing laws, his sentence was later modified to allow for review after a set period. The case remained notable for the calculated effort to mask the killings and the contrast between the crime and the public gathering held in the same space. Case 5. November 26, 2016, Knoxville, Tennessee. Two parents were found murdered and dismembered inside their home during the Thanksgiving weekend. Joel Guy S.R. and Lisa Guy were killed in a prolonged and violent attack that occurred within the residence they shared. The condition of the scene immediately indicated intentional homicide rather than an accident or break-in. The killings were contained within the home, with no signs of forced entry. As investigators began reviewing the circumstances surrounding the deaths, attention quickly turned to the couple's adult son, who had been staying at the house during the holiday period. Police initiated a welfare check after Lisa Guy failed to report to work following Thanksgiving. Her absence was uncharacteristic and raised immediate concern among colleagues. Officers were dispatched to the family home, where they encountered an overwhelming odor and visible signs of disturbance. Upon entering, they discovered a scene of extreme violence, including dismembered remains and chemical substances consistent with attempts to destroy evidence. The layout of the scene suggested the killings had occurred hours earlier. With no indication of outside involvement, investigators began identifying individuals who had recent access to the residence. The circumstances pointed toward a suspect already familiar with the home and its occupants. Joel Guy S.R. and Lisa Guy had spent years supporting their only son financially. Despite being an adult, Joel Michael Guy Jr. remained dependent on his parents for housing, expenses, and general financial stability. In the period leading up to the killings, the parents had decided to end that support and require their son to become independent. This decision marked a significant shift in the family dynamic. Records later showed that the son had no steady employment and relied almost entirely on his parents' assistance. The impending financial cutoff became a central element in understanding the context of the crime. What appeared to be a routine family boundary instead escalated into violence. During the investigation, detectives uncovered a handwritten journal belonging to Joel Michael Guy Jr. Inside were detailed not.'s outlining plans for murder and the disposal of bodies. The entries described methods, sequencing, and the use of chemicals, written in advance of the killings. Investigators matched the contents of the journal to the condition of the crime scene, noting direct alignment between the plans and the actions taken. Forensic analysis confirmed that the chemicals found in the home had been used in an attempt to decompose remains. The discovery of the journal eliminated ambiguity about intent and established clear premeditation. Surveillance footage from nearby locations showed Joel Michael Guy Jr. purchasing supplies consistent with the materials found at the scene. Additional video evidence placed him at the home during the time frame in which the murders occurred. Forensic testing linked him directly to the remains and tools used. When confronted with the evidence, his explanations failed to account for the planning documents and physical findings. Authorities arrested him and charged him in connection with the killings. The combination of written plans, forensic evidence, and surveillance records formed a comprehensive evidentiary record tying him to the crime. Joel Michael Guy Jr. was tried on multiple charges, including first-degree murder. During the proceedings, prosecutors presented the journal, forensic testimony, and video evidence to demonstrate deliberate planning and execution. The defense did not dispute the existence of the materials but challenged interpretations of intent. The court rejected those arguments, finding the evidence conclusive. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The case concluded with a judicial determination that the killings were the result of calculated actions taken in response to the loss of financial support, leaving no unresolved factual dispute. Case 6. November 13, 1974, Amityville, New York. 6 members of the DeFeo family were found shot inside their home at 112 Ocean Avenue. The victims included Ronald DeFeo S.R., his wife Louise, and their 4 children. Each had been killed in their beds during the early morning hours. The scale of the violence immediately drew widespread attention, as the killings appeared to have occurred without any sign of forced entry or struggle. The house was quiet when police arrived, and the victims were discovered face down, arranged in a manner that suggested a controlled and deliberate act. From the outset, the crime presented questions that could not be answered by chance or random intrusion. Police became involved after Ronald DeFeo Jr. arrived at a local establishment claiming he had discovered his parents had been shot. Officers followed him back to the residence, where they entered and confirmed the deaths. The initial report framed the event as a mass killing carried out by unknown perpetrators. Ronald DeFeo Jr. appeared distraught and claimed to have no knowledge of who was responsible. As officers secured the scene, they began documenting the positions of the bodies and the absence of signs indicating an external attack. The lack of disturbance and the precise nature of the killings raised early concerns. While the investigation initially remained open to multiple possibilities, the circumstances quickly narrowed the scope of plausible explanations. The DeFeo family was known in the community as outwardly successful. Ronald DeFeo Sr. operated a car dealership and provided financial stability for the household. The family lived in a large home that reflected economic comfort. Behind this appearance, however, there were long-standing issues within the household. Reports later detailed frequent conflict between Ronald DeFeo Jr. and his father. Substance abuse, particularly involving drugs and alcohol, was present in the family dynamic. Tensions were documented by acquaintances and neighbors who recalled volatile interactions. These underlying issues contrasted sharply with the image of prosperity and order presented to the outside world. Investigators identified these internal dynamics as relevant to understanding the events leading up to the killings. As detectives questioned Ronald DeFeo Jr., inconsistencies emerged in his account of the morning and the preceding night. His statements changed with repetition, and elements of his story did not align with physical evidence. Ballistics analysis indicated that all victims had been shot with the same rifle, owned by the family. The lack of evidence supporting the presence of intruders further weakened alternative theories. Investigators noted that the victims appeared not to have awakened or resisted, despite the use of a high-powered firearm. These findings pointed away from an external attack and toward a controlled act carried out by someone familiar with the home. As scrutiny intensified, focus centered increasingly on DeFeo Jr. himself. After extended questioning, Ronald DeFeo Jr. confessed to the murders. He admitted to shooting each family member in succession during the early hours of the morning. The confession aligned with the forensic evidence and resolved remaining uncertainties about the sequence of events. Although he later altered aspects of his account, the initial admission provided investigators with a clear framework for prosecution. No evidence emerged supporting the involvement of additional perpetrators. The confession marked the definitive turning point in the case, shifting it from investigation to legal proceedings. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was charged with 6 counts of second-degree murder. During the trial, prosecutors presented forensic findings, witness testimony, and his own statements to establish responsibility. The defense raised issues related to mental health and substance abuse, but the jury rejected those arguments. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 25 years to life for each murder, to be served concurrently. DeFeo Jr. remained incarcerated for decades, during which he repeatedly changed his version of events. In March 2021, he died in prison. The case remained one of the most notorious family killings in American criminal history, defined by the collapse of an outwardly successful household into lethal internal violence. Case 7. July 10, 2001, North Ryde, Sydney. 3 members of the Gonzalez family were stabbed to death inside their home. The victims were Teddy and Mary Gonzalez and their teenage daughter, Claudine. The killings occurred during the night and were confined to the residence, with no signs of forced entry. The discovery immediately drew national attention due to the apparent brutality and the absence of an obvious external suspect. At the center of the case was the family's surviving son, Seth Gonzalez, who presented himself as a devastated survivor in the hours following the murders. Emergency responders entered the home after receiving reports indicating multiple fatalities at the address. Police secured the scene and confirmed that all 3 victims had died from stab wounds. The condition of the house initially suggested a violent intrusion, reinforced by graffiti and markings found on interior walls. These elements appeared to indicate a racially motivated attack. Seth Gonzalez provided statements consistent with this narrative, describing unknown assailants and expressing fear for his own safety. However, as officers documented the scene in detail, questions arose about the timing and authenticity of the markings. The physical evidence began to conflict with the initial explanation provided at the scene. The victims were immigrant parents who had worked to establish financial stability and support their children's education. They placed significant expectations on academic success and continued to provide financial and emotional support to their son. Their daughter was still in school and lived at home. Seth Gonzalez was believed by his family to be pursuing higher education and maintaining progress toward a professional future. In reality, investigators later confirmed he had failed academically and concealed this from his parents. The family dynamic was shaped by support and expectation, with the parents unaware of the extent of their son's deception. This gap between belief and reality became a central contextual element. As the investigation advanced, forensic analysis revealed that the graffiti and hate crime indicators had been applied after the killings. Blood pattern analysis and sequencing showed the markings could not have been present during the attacks. Detectives identified inconsistencies in Seth Gonzalez's statements regarding timelines and movements. No evidence supported the presence of outside attackers. Investigators also uncovered records showing the accused stood to gain control over family assets following the deaths. The staged elements, rather than diverting attention, narrowed investigative focus. Each attempt to reinforce the false narrative produced further contradictions. Detectives dismantled the staged hate crime explanation through forensic testing and reconstruction of events. As the false narrative collapsed, attention centered exclusively on Seth Gonzalez. Investigators documented his behavior following the killings, noting a lack of injuries consistent with an external attack and actions inconsistent with a traumatized survivor. Confronted with the evidence, the account he had provided unraveled. Authorities identified him as the sole perpetrator based on physical evidence, financial motive, and the absence of alternative suspects. His arrest marked the conclusion of the investigative phase and the transition to prosecution. Seth Gonzalez was charged with the murders of his parents and sister. During the trial, prosecutors presented forensic findings, financial records, and evidence demonstrating deliberate staging intended to mislead police. The defense was unable to reconcile the physical evidence with the claim of an external attack. The court found the evidence sufficient to establish intent and responsibility. Gonzalez was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The case concluded with a definitive finding that the murders were the result of calculated actions designed to conceal academic failure and secure financial control, leaving no unresolved factual dispute. Case 8. July 22, 2015, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. 5 members of the Bever family were killed during a knife attack inside their home. The victims included the parents and 3 of their children. The killings occurred late at night and were confined entirely to the residence. 2 siblings survived the attack. The scale of the violence and the involvement of multiple victims immediately classified the incident as a mass homicide. From the earliest moments, The circumstances indicated that the attack originated from within the household, rather than from an outside intruder. Police were alerted after a surviving sibling made a 911 call reporting that her brothers were attacking the family. The call was placed while the attack was still ongoing. Dispatch records confirmed the caller reported multiple stabbings and identified her brothers as the assailants. Officers arrived at the residence within minutes. Upon entry, they encountered extensive blood evidence throughout the home. Several victims were found deceased, while one sibling was critically injured but alive. The immediacy of the call and the conditions inside the house provided law enforcement with a clear understanding that the threat had originated internally. The responding officers moved quickly to secure the scene and locate the suspects. The victims were members of an isolated household where the children were homeschooled and had limited contact with the outside community. The parents exercised strict control over the household environment and daily routines. The family lived together under one roof, with little outside oversight or intervention. Investigators later noted that the isolation played a role in shaping the internal dynamics of the household. The surviving children had grown up largely separated from peers and external social structures. This environment formed the context in which the events unfolded, with the attack emerging from within the family unit itself. During the investigation, detectives recovered documents, writings, and digital materials from inside the home. These records showed months of planning by the two brothers prior to the attack. Investigators identified content reflecting admiration for mass violence and prior mass killings. Notes detailed intentions, sequencing, and anticipated outcomes. The materials demonstrated that the attack had been planned in advance rather than carried out impulsively. Forensic examination of the scene aligned with the documented plans, confirming deliberate execution. The presence of these materials removed uncertainty regarding motive and preparation, clearly establishing premeditation. Police apprehended both brothers at the scene shortly after arrival. They were found armed and did not escape the residence. Officers took them into custody without further injury to others. Evidence recovered from their persons and from the home linked them directly to the attack. There was no indication of additional suspects or external involvement. The immediate arrest concluded the active threat and allowed investigators to transition fully into evidence processing and case construction. Responsibility for the killings was established at the scene. Both brothers were charged with multiple counts of murder. During court proceedings, prosecutors presented physical evidence, planning documents, and testimony detailing the sequence of events. The defense raised issues related to age and background, but the court focused on the documented planning and severity of the crimes. Each brother was convicted and sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. The case concluded with a clear judicial finding that the killings were the result of deliberate, ideologically motivated planning carried out within the family home, leaving no unresolved factual questions. Case 9. August 7, 1985, White House Farm, Essex. 5 members of the same family were found shot inside a rural farmhouse in what initially appeared to be a murder-suicide. The victims were Neville and June Bamber, their daughter Sheila Caffell, and her 6-year-old twin sons, Daniel and Nicholas. A rifle was found near Sheila's body, and early assessments suggested she had killed her family before turning the weapon on herself. The scene appeared contained, with no immediate signs of forced entry. For a brief period, the narrative of a family tragedy driven by mental illness went largely unquestioned. Police responded after receiving a call reporting violence inside the farmhouse. The call was attributed to information relayed by Jeremy Bam, the sole surviving family member, who stated that his father had phoned him during the night claiming Sheila was acting violently with a gun. Officers entered the farmhouse in the early hours and discovered the bodies positioned throughout the house. The initial scene appeared to support the account of a murder-suicide. Sheila had a documented history of mental health issues, which reinforced the early theory. However, as officers documented the scene and began formal analysis, elements emerged that did not fully align with that explanation. Victims were immediate members of Jeremy Bamber's family. Neville and June Bamber were his adoptive parents and owners of White House Farm, a substantial property representing long-term financial stability. Sheila Caffell was Jeremy's sister, who had been staying at the farmhouse with her twin sons. The family dynamic involved ongoing tension, particularly related to control of the estate and inheritance. Investigators later documented disputes and strained relationships within the family. These underlying issues existed alongside the outward appearance of a successful rural household, forming the broader context in which the killings occurred. As the investigation progressed, forensic analysis began to undermine the murder-suicide narrative. Ballistics and blood pattern evidence indicated inconsistencies with the positioning of the rifle and the manner of Sheila's death. The weapon appeared to have been wiped clean, and experts concluded it would have been physically difficult for Sheila to have shot herself with the rifle as found. Further examination revealed staged elements within the farmhouse. A critical discovery was a sound suppressor found in a cupboard containing traces of blood. Forensic experts determined that with the suppressor attached, the rifle would have been too long for a self-inflicted shot, directly contradicting the initial conclusion. The discovery of the suppressed rifle shifted the focus of the investigation. Detectives reassessed Jeremy Bamber's statements and movements, identifying weaknesses in his alibi. Witness testimony revealed that he had spoken previously about wanting his family dead and had discussed framing his sister. Financial records showed he stood to benefit from the inheritance of the farm and estate. With the physical evidence contradicting the suicide explanation and pointing toward deliberate staging, police arrested Jeremy Bamber. The arrest marked the collapse of the original narrative and the identification of a single suspect. Jeremy Bamber was charged with 5 counts of murder. During the trial, prosecutors presented forensic findings, witness testimony, and evidence of motive tied to inheritance. The defense argued alternative theories and challenged the investigation, but the court accepted the forensic conclusions regarding the staged scene and the suppressed rifle. The jury found Bamber guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. In the years following his conviction, Bamber continued to maintain his innocence and pursued multiple appeals, all unsuccessful. The case remained one of the most scrutinized in British criminal history, defined by the transformation of an apparent murder-suicide into a proven act of calculated familial homicide. Case 10. August 20, 1989, Beverly Hills, California. Entertainment executive Jose Menendez and his wife Kitty Menendez were shot dead inside their home. Both victims were found in the den, killed at close range with shotguns. The killings occurred late in the evening and were contained entirely within the residence. There were no immediate signs of forced entry, and valuables appeared untouched. The brutality of the attack contrasted sharply with the family's public image of wealth and success. In the hours that followed, attention focused on the couple's sons, Lyle and Eric Menendez, who were the only people known to be in the home that night. The brothers reported discovering their parents murdered after returning home. They contacted emergency services and described finding the bodies upon entering the residence. Police responded and secured the scene, initially treating the sons as grieving victims rather than suspects. Early investigative efforts focused on the possibility of an organized crime hit or external attackers due to Jose Menendez's business profile. The brothers' accounts were documented, and no immediate arrests were made. However, as detectives continued gathering information, the absence of forced entry and the controlled nature of the crime raised questions. The initial narrative remained in place only temporarily. Jose and Kitty Menendez lived a life defined by extreme wealth and privilege. The family resided in an upscale Beverly Hills neighborhood and maintained a lifestyle supported by Jose Menendez's successful career. Within the household, relationships were marked by strict control and internal conflict. The sons were raised to endure high expectations, with financial dependence and authority centralized within the parents. Investigators later documented long-standing tension inside the family structure. While the exterior reflected affluence and stability, internal dynamics suggested pressure and discord. These factors formed the background against which the killings occurred. As the investigation continued, attention shifted due to the brothers' behavior following the deaths. Financial records showed rapid and extensive spending on luxury items, travel, and personal indulgences using their parents' assets. This behavior contrasted with typical patterns of bereavement and drew scrutiny from investigators. The case took a decisive turn when Eric Menendez made recorded admissions during psychological sessions, which were later disclosed to authorities. These admissions directly implicated both brothers in the killings. The combination of spending patterns and recorded statements redirected the investigation away from external suspects and toward the sons. Law enforcement arrested Lyle and Eric Menendez after the recorded admissions became known. Investigators reassessed earlier statements and reconstructed the timeline of events inside the home. Evidence showed that the killings were carried out deliberately and that the brothers had attempted to establish an alternative narrative following the crime. With the confession evidence and supporting financial records, prosecutors moved forward with formal charges. The arrests marked the definitive shift from an unsolved double homicide to a prosecution centered on familial perpetrators. The Menendez brothers were charged with first-degree murder. Their trials drew national attention and became one of the most publicized criminal cases in American history. Prosecutors argued the murders were motivated by financial gain and control over the family fortune. The defense presented an alternative explanation centered on long-term abuse, reframing the killings as acts driven by fear rather than greed. After an initial mistrial, a second trial resulted in convictions. Both brothers were found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case continued to generate debate for decades, remaining a focal point in discussions about motive, family dynamics, and criminal responsibility.